I'd be curious if you'd be interested in talking a little more about lineages.
Yeah, it's something that I think about quite a lot. I don't have any particularly general observations other than this is important, and different lineages in very different disciplines seem to be in some ways similar. What makes you interested in this, and what direction would you like to take it?
Yeah. So similarly, I found that the notion of lineages has just been so much more clarifying than other vague notions that I had. I think maybe 5 years ago, if I was asked to think about science or music, I might talk about genres or fields. But I think that fields are actually much less helpful than thinking about the lineages
Mm,
and also the ideas within them. I have come to this conviction that a lot of the dense learning that I am doing, a lot of the dense learning that I think of humans collectively are engaging in, is usually within dialogue within some type of lineage. So
hmm
for me, that has been both musical. I have been finding people. I found two professors, or one professor, one teacher at Berkeley, who were both within this like Cuban jazz lineage, and I see that there's a consistency in the way that they think about the music that's quite meaningfully different than, say, like a blues player or something like that. And there's something very, very important about that specificity, I think. And also, I kind of think about the intellectual lineage too. I have been trained or spent a lot of time studying computer science, but there's some transition out of this very systematic way of trying to look at the world into a more general way has taken place also within the context of a lineage that I might call like the Heidegger Dreyfus lineage that I'm engaged in. So yeah, that's what it means to me. Maybe the first prompt, what lineages do you consider yourself to have been part of?
Yeah, so many. I mean, my official education was in artificial intelligence, which is a lineage with a lot of substrands that are different lineages and that had very different styles of thinking, and they were all dealing with the same issues, but from quite different points of view. And I was influenced by several of those. And those trace back philosophical lineages that are previous to artificial intelligence as well. Philosophy, I think, is very big on lineage. In general, the humanities, you read old books, and so that's kind of automatically puts you into a lineage or many lineages. I took courses in the Harvard English department from a professor there who was in a lineage of understanding of the nature of epic. I'll get a little specific.
Yeah, please
Um,
do.
so there was a field of study of epic which tried to figure out, the big questions where how was the poems attributed to Homer, how were those actually composed? Was there really a single person, Homer, who invented them? And if you look closely at the texts, people had very strong opinions about, no, this was actually a collective effort. And because it predates writing, there's a whole lot of tricks in there, which are mnemonics for being able, people actually memorized the whole of the Odyssey and would perform it from memory. And, the question is, how on earth do you do that? And these tricks were part of that. But this is all conjecture because that was 3,000 years ago. And then somebody discovered that I hope I'm going to get this right, I think Bulgaria, there were in the early 20th century still performers of epic in a purely oral tradition who performed the local epics. And so one could study that and figure out how it was that they were able to perform it, but also how the poems came about. So, principal disciple of Milman Parry, who studied these, I think, Bulgarian skalds. What's the word in English? Skald is the Old English word for an epic performer.
Like a bard?
Yeah, bard. There we are. That's the word I'm looking for. So Milman Parry's principal disciple was Albert Lord, who was at Harvard. And
Hmm.
then his principal disciple was William Alfred, who was at Harvard, who I studied with. And Albert Lord principally studied Old English, which was an oral tradition of bards reciting these epic poems of glorious battles and Beowulf and stuff.
Hmm.
The same kinds of things that you find in these Bulgarian epics, you find in Homer, you found in Beowulf and similar poems. I found Old English fascinating. Beowulf is fascinating. There's all kinds of connections with Tolkien, who was doing the same work at Oxford at the same time that Albert Lord was doing it at Harvard. They were sort of equivalent figures, and so I kind of studied with the American Tolkien's principal disciple, and he just made an enormous impression on me. He was very kind and wise man. He was very close to retirement age when I studied with him. I was a 19-year-old idiot and didn't really appreciate what an amazing thing it was to be studying with him and to be part of that lineage. I mean, I haven't done research on Old English. I can't remember any of it to speak of, although apparently I can remember the word skald and I can't remember the word bard, so some of it stuck.
What looked up because I was curious, but the Odyssey takes about 10 hours to read, I think, if it's because it says here about 130 words. That seems plausible that there were people who would be able to memorize it and had these mnemonic tricks. There was a man that I heard of. I think he's like 60 years old, and he was determined to learn Dante's Inferno, I think, which is longer than the Odyssey, and it took him, I think, 5 to 10 years to learn, and then he was successfully able to, I think, almost entirely accurately, like one or two words, recite it. And yeah, I'm very curious about this thread of how the actual words and how the stories become internalized in the process of us remembering and then reconstructing it. But I don't know that that's the impression that William Alfred had on you.
Well, I found the process of memorization intellectually interesting. I think the reason he made a very big impression on me was something about his demeanor and way of teaching
Mm-hmm.
and the sort of enormous breadth of his knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
that he could bring in all kinds of, so what did I know, but seemingly very obscure material.
Mm-hmm.
But he'd been reading for decades longer than I had. So
Yeah. And so that feels like an important lineage. There's also the AI lineage. You mentioned Patrick Winston before as also another person who you now see and appreciate more than you did then. When I read your writing, the primary lineages that I imagine are the Arrow Tear for Buddhism,
mhm.
Vajrayana, and then the AI lineage, which initially maybe had Patrick Winston, and then there was Dreyfus, who you had a discourse with. Would you amend that or add more detail?
The thing about Patrick Winston is that I didn't appreciate him at the time. I wasn't a student of his. He had stopped doing research by the time I was there and become the head guy in the lab as essentially an administrator. And what I didn't have any sense of and didn't appreciate and now do in retrospect was how very skillful and thoughtful and kind he was about holding together a couple hundred aggressive weirdos and having the AI lab be productive and collegial, despite all of us actually being, well, some of us at least, being rather unpleasant people, myself certainly included. To the extent that I was really influenced by anybody intellectually there, it was by Marvin Minsky. And my estimation of him has decreased where my estimation of Patrick Winston has increased. In retrospect, I can't really understand what made Marvin Minsky seem so compelling at the time. He obviously was absolutely brilliant. I think not a lot of people know things like he invented something called a confocal microscope, which was a breakthrough in improving the optical resolving power of light microscopes, which is very helpful in biology. He just sort of did all kinds of things like that. So he was brilliant, but the work that he was doing at the time that I was his, more or less his student, in retrospect, I can't make any sense of it. I don't know why that made sense then. In terms of Buddhism, I feel that I hold or belong to several. My first experience was with Shambhala training, which was a system devised by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. That's where I learned to meditate. I still meditate in that style, which is embarrassing because I should update to a style that I was supposed to update to 30 years ago and never got around to.
Shine, or
Well, yeah. It's a different different version of Shine. I mean, Shine is just the Tibetan translation of shamatha,
right.
and every kind of Buddhism has shamatha, but what it actually consists of is different.
Mhm.
The difference between the Shambhala Shine, which I think comes from Mahamudra, and the one taught by Charlie Aubrey, my spouse, which is closer to the Arotere, although Charlie's version is a little different from the Arotere's. Those pull apart Shine and Latong to isolate form and emptiness and then reintegrate them.
Mhm.
And the teaching is Nime, the non-dual nature of form and emptiness, which is the equivalence of the experiences of Shine and Latong. But you get that by pulling them apart first so you can see the two of them separately. In the Shambhala system, it's explicit from the start that shamatha and vipassana, which is Latong in Tibetan. Vipassana is the Tibetan, Pali is vipassana. They're all the same word. Those are considered to be essentially aspects of the same thing from the beginning. And that's the way I've continued to practice. I also consider myself to be in the lineage of Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche, who is a eclectic Tibetan teacher of Dzogchen and Vajrayana and the whole of Tibetan Buddhism. I attended, 3 or 4, something like that, retreats with him. And again, he made an enormous impression on me. And he, more than anyone else, is the person who made Dzogchen available in the West. There's other people, but I think it's really he that did it. And he also is very important in having resurrected 2 lineages within, or maybe more than 2, but at least 2 lineages within Tibetan Buddhism that are very influential for me, and I think for the Arotere and for Charlie, which are Ana Yoga, which had become essentially theoretical and forgotten, and Dzogchen Longde, which also, the texts were still there and maybe somebody could give the Wang, but they were essentially defunct, and Namkhai Norbu revived those. And both of those are systems that are particularly relevant and useful for contemporary Westerners.
Mhm.
There's lots of systems of Kumye. Tolku, who is Berkeley, he also brought Dzogchen to the West very early, late 70s. He teaches the system of Kumye. That was one of his central teachings. Very early, he was somehow brought to an Italian university by an Italian professor. I think it was Giuseppe Tucci, and given a professorship and was a normal Western university professor somehow. And he did that for a long time, and he wasn't really teaching Buddhism except academically. He wasn't teaching it as a Lama. And at some point that shifted, and he started teaching as a Lama. And then, because he was very inspiring, I guess, he started to attract students from around the world, and then he started flying around the world to give retreats everywhere. So the ones I went to him with were in California and in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Hmm. And then obviously the arrow tears, the third lineage that you would add in addition to Namkai Norbu and Shambhala.
Yeah, and I don't know, evolving ground may be evolving towards being its own lineage. Increasingly has its own practices and liturgy and so on. So maybe I'm actually, unfortunately, a bit remote from that. I haven't had the time to be as involved as I'd like to be. I see it from some distance, as it were. But of course, Charlie and I are talking all the time, so I've got some sense of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing you mentioned just before was about this. When you read a book, you're also engaging in some type of lineage. But there, to me, is a pretty marked difference between meeting the teacher and dialoguing with them. And
Yes.
in Vajrayana, there's a lot of emphasis on transmission and empowerment. Transmission seems some kind of like a mystical thing that some people think only can happen when you're in the presence of the Lama. I wonder if you, maybe in your own experience, how you have come to think about what I would say is basically just learning, different types of learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think the teachers who really made a big impression on me are ones who somehow taught through their demeanor, through their way of being. And I mean, Professor Alfred would talk about, he wrote Broadway plays, and so he would talk about that. Or he was a devout Catholic and rarely brought that in, but occasionally it would come in. So, and Ngak'chang Rinpoche, he talked less and less about Buddhism during the time I was his student. By the end, he basically didn't talk about Buddhism at all. He would just talk about whatever happened to be interesting to him at the time, and some Buddhism came through along with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think reading about how oral epic works in a book would actually give you very little sense of it. There's something that Professor Alfred said that really stuck with me. He said that there was, in the basement of the Harvard Library, which goes 12 stories underground or something, there's a bunch of reel-to-reel tapes from the 1940s or 50s where Albert Lord was performing, I think, Beowulf, and accompanying himself on whatever the stringed instrument is called that skalds of the time played. And the oral epics are sung, they're not spoken, they're not recited, they have a melody, and this is a big part of how you remember it. It's a lot easier to remember a song than to remember a poem without a melody. So Professor Alford was a student of Albert Lord, but he discovered these tapes, I guess, after Albert Lord was dead. And he listened to them, and he just said this made such an enormous impression on him that it was so powerful. And ever since then, I've been thinking, God, I have to get into the basement of the Harvard Library, 7 stories underground, and listen to these tapes. Or maybe somebody's digitized them by now, and maybe I could even find them online.
One way that I'm thinking about the lineage stuff is also in reference to your Metarationality book. The book, it kind of has an implicit theory that you can teach some of these things by reading about it, right? Is there a sense of how scientific knowledge transmission might be akin to or different than these other types of lineage transmissions?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It just so happens that the chunk that I'm writing right now, I'm hoping it'll be out in a day or two, is squarely about this question. It's called Making Meta-Rationality Available, and it's about how it can be taught. There's some things that reading a book is nearly useless for, like learning to drive a car. You just have to sit in the car with somebody who knows how to drive, and they watch you and they stop you from driving headlong into oncoming traffic and stuff. And there's some things where you actually can learn them pretty much just from a book. And then there's some things where you need both. And the example I use is medicine, where you spend a lot of time in the classroom and you read a lot of stuff, but you also then do a residency where you're getting some years of hands-on experience with a mentor who will be looking over your shoulder to varying degrees and giving you advice. I think meta-rationality is like that. I think science is like that. I think you can't learn to do science just from books, although you need to read an enormous amount. But if you're going to become an actual scientist, you need a mentor, you need an apprenticeship, you need somebody showing you all of the things that are not in the books. It's practical stuff that, how do you use the lab equipment, improving your pipetting technique or something. But there's also the meta-rational component, which is about how to think and how do you come up with a scientific hypothesis? How do you choose what field is worth pursuing? What questions are interesting in what ways? How do you develop a sense of smell for where a line of investigation might lead? Is it going to open up and be exciting, or is that going to be a dead end? You're stuck on some problem. What are ways of getting unstuck that are not problem solving? You're stuck on the problem solving, but the getting unstuck from that isn't a matter of problem solving. So I've actually got a dialogue, a Socratic dialogue in this piece that I'm currently working on of a professor and a graduate student, where the graduate student has gone down a blind alley and the professor is saying, hey, wait, stop, you're going down a blind alley here, and then leads the student through what are the meta-rational lessons that can be learned from this particular mistake, actually.
Have you come across the 4 Ps as John Vervaeke talks about?
Yeah, I can never remember all of them are, but there's
Yeah,
propositional knowledge, procedural knowledge, perspectival knowledge, and
participatory.
there we are.
The natural thing to think about when I'm trying to think about the learning and transmission is that the propositional knowledge is what is most clearly conveyed through books.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes great books like literature, stories can convey some perspectival knowledge too. You
Mm-hmm.
get a sense of what it is like to be in Berlin as a Jew in the 1920s or something. But to a large extent, procedural and then participatory knowledge is not accessible through like a textual form or even through like a static form.
Mm-hmm.
And those are like learning new ways of being in the world, that's participatory, and also learning very practically subtle things about how you do things in the world. And those are the things that require the live transmission.
Yeah, I think that seems right.
And the interesting thing might be, how might video and like what, if we're thinking about these types of knowledge and video, so as I'm looking at you, there's the visual of you, and I can see your facial expressions and I can hear you pretty clearly, but I can't see your body language, and I also can't see you in context with how you talk to Charlie or how you cook food. And so maybe we can think of that as like greatly narrowing the ways in which the participatory knowledge is accessible. But if we are working through, I have some statistics analysis and then I share my screen and you look and you give feedback to it, because the nature of those skills are somewhat more like virtual or amenable to textual comparison, then it's possible to do a lot, if not most of that type of learning via remotely. And the reason this might be interesting to you for the Metarationality book is because I imagine ultimately you're trying to publish this as a book online, but there might be some other forms of exercises or practice or groups that you want to be able to convey this, right?
Yes. So there's a couple things there. Maybe I'll talk about the Vajrayana context first briefly, and then we could talk about metarationality. Ngak'chang Rinpoche and Khandra Dechen, his wife, quite regularly had students come and stay with them and live with them for periods. And I think they, most of the time had a student with them in their house. And so, you would be there eating with them, cooking with them, washing up the dishes, going to the store. I think that's how I learned most from Ngak'chang Rinpoche's times there together, partly through just his way of being when washing dishes, and partly we were working together on the website that's now called arabuddhism.org. And I just learned an enormous amount from him through our collaboration on that. So working together on a project is a mode of learning that is, I think, especially effective for apprenticeship.
Mhm.
And I think that's the way that he worked with all of his students who were reasonably close. And I think it's the way that Charlie works with their students the most. So he has taken a very hard line against giving transmission over video. I think one of his most recent recordings was specifically about that. Namkhai Norbu gave transmission, ritual transmission, Wang in Tibetan means empowerment. It's kind of the most important ritual in Tibetan Buddhism. He was very happy to do that by broadcast video to 1,000 people at once. And I never experienced that, so I don't have a sense of how that worked or didn't work. I imagine it worked for a lot of people because he wasn't dumb. I don't think he'd have done it if it didn't work at all. I also can really understand Ngak'chang Rinpoche's hard line on, this just can't work. It just inherently can't work. And I think not for, he might invoke magical, metaphysical, mystical reasons, which I wouldn't, but I, just from the sense of being with him, I can see why that would be the case. I would like to, and it's been my intention for most of a decade now, to teach meta-rationality in person. I've made one attempt at that. I haven't had the time or circumstances to do that since then, which was a good many years ago. But it is my intention to do that. And I think you're right that a lot of the material probably needs to be conveyed in person and probably by working on projects. And I think that's the way that scientific apprenticeship works. The student is working on some piece of science, working out the way to do an experiment, trying to get it to work. And the professor says, well, have you thought of this? Maybe you should try that. I think the reason this didn't work is probably thus and so. And that may be the mode in which meta-rationality also needs to get transmitted.
Mm-hmm. I was, for an experiment that I was doing as an undergraduate, learning how mixed linear effects models are supposed to be applied. And the canonical paper uses this example of cats and cat food. So there is this, from my understanding of the paper, it's standard practice when you're trying to apply linear mixed effects models to separate things into random effects and fixed effects. So a random effect might be the particular cat's inclination towards this food. That's for the individual cat. But then the example they give of a fixed effect is the tastiness of the food. Right. And I was revisiting this and I was like, what? And then I was thinking about fixed effects generally. And I think how Fisher first proposed it was to talk about crop yields and how much each crop would yield. I mean, it was very apparent to me, and I'm sure it's immediately apparent to you, that like there is no such thing as a fixed effect. There's nothing that's an objective property of the cat food or this plant crop. But this seems to have been just very, very much this basic assumption of statistics.
Yeah, I mean, these are characteristically meta-rational observations you've just made. If anybody wants to know what is meta-rationality, it's like, oh, what Max just said. I think when those foundations were being done, they didn't have computers yet, so they had to make a lot of radical simplifications just in order to have it be practical to do the computations. And there is a problem that those underlying assumptions haven't been fully revised after it's now feasible to do enormously more arithmetic. So Gelman has championed Monte Carlo methods that are high dimensional space, enormous amount of data, and you just have to do random sampling. And that's a very different approach than Fisher. And it's an approach that leverages our ability to do a trillion multiplies a second, which Fisher didn't have access to.
Mm. Does that address the nebulosity of our notion of fixed effects?
Yeah, I think it kind of does, because you're looking at the data without as much of a preconceived model.
Mm-hmm.
I think he would be quick to say that you're always making assumptions and you have to be aware of what assumptions you are making, but you can relax a lot of the assumptions that were necessary when there weren't computers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this experience for me of trying to do the statistics for this paper was really interesting because I think it demonstrated to me that there's an abject lack of understanding of what statistics is and is used for among even the most eminent scientists. And this person was a really great mentor. He's a really kind person, kind of a pretty brilliant scientist. He was a psychology professor at Harvard. But he was also like, honestly, I don't understand this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one guy in our lab who kind of knows what's going on, and you can talk to him. But yeah, this is the paper that I read, this mixed linear effects model of cat food. And we're going to be applying this. And probably it's better if you make it Bayesian somehow. But exactly how, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is now recognized as an enormous problem in experimental psychology,
Mm-hmm.
that people don't have enough education in statistics. But I think there's often a sense that, well, we need to teach more statistical methods more rigorously, and
Yeah.
that might be true, but it's still missing the point that what you really need to teach is the meta-rational aspect of statistics, of asking, what are we actually trying to find out here, and will this method actually tell us what we want to know?
Right.
Can it in principle even do that? And then in terms of practice, like, do we have enough data points that we could get an answer to this question?
Hmm. And I mean, there's also something I feel like that you, if it's a really clear effect or something, then you shouldn't even need statistics to be able
Yeah.
to recognize it,
Yes.
right? So yeah, in some sense, maybe you're even going wrong when you're having to dig around in your statistics toolkit.
Well, I think there's sometimes when statistics are appropriate, but I think that meta-rational observation that if something is important, you probably can see it by plotting it and looking at it,
Mhm.
instead of trying to apply something that's going to torture the data enough to give you a p-value that you can publish.
Yeah, this is interesting. I'm kind of reminded of so when James T. Scott talks about seeing like a state, making things more legible to states and city states, one thing I wonder is if statistics is the form of that, of like state or modernist capture of science, because what ends up mattering is that it's legible to an institutional process whereby you can sort papers that are significant or not significant because of this 0.05 threshold.
Yeah.
When like older science or proper science is you actually asking, does this make sense? Do I believe that this is actually happening?
Yeah. I think that's the fundamental problem with science now, where it's gone wrong, is substituting legible metrics for actual understanding, and then everybody games those metrics. But even if they weren't gaming the metrics, you're still not getting the understanding. You've got a large enough sample size. Yes, you got your p-value, but so what? That turns into what I call rationality theater, where you're going through the motions of rationality, but it's kind of pretend, and you even know that it's kind of pretend, but the standard is it's got to be p less than, so that's the standard, so that's what you have to do because the institutions demand it. There's a problem for the institutions, which is that they have to be fair. They have, institutional rationality demands that you treat people fairly, and you can't just say, well, that guy's a good scientist and that guy's a bad scientist, so we'll, do whatever. You need some kind of objective measure, but then there is no objective measure. Before the Second World War, scientists, it was a club, and scientists could say, yeah, that guy's good, that guy's bad, we'll let him in the club, we won't let him in the club. And that worked better in a lot of ways, but it was also unfair and exclusive and didn't assign credit accurately and led people into a lot of blind alleys, probably.
So another domain that this is kind of a problem is like music and performance, because if we want to think about this in terms of feedback loops, a very clear feedback loop is when you're fighting someone. So there's no ambiguity as to who the welterweight champion of boxing is, right? You go in a ring and then you score. I mean, there's some technical scoring ambiguity, but it's a lot less ambiguous. And when it comes to like jazz guitar, jazz piano, or something, there is some sense in which people can tend to agree, but like a layperson might not be able to distinguish what like a musician might be able to. And so I wonder if you think that there's some productive way that we can understand how music or like musicians might deal with this. Like one thing I'm imagining is this blind audition. Um, you're not allowed to see who the performance is, just a panel of judges, and then they say yes or no. Is there something like that that could work for science too? I mean, that's what peer review, I guess, is supposed to be, but that doesn't seem to work.
That's an interesting question. I think sometimes peer review is done with the blinded to who the author is and what their institution is. I remember reading what the effect of that was, but I can't remember what the answer is. Peer review's gotten to have a bad reputation, and I think deservedly so.
Hmm.
Yeah.
the idea of having it being blinded, I think, is very clearly good
Hmm.
in many respects. But the fact that, if you want to present at NeurIPS or any computer science conference, that some volunteer who's also going to the conference, it'll take them like 4 hours to read the paper,
Hmm.
and you have to rely on people to volunteer 20 hours. Like, what is in there? Why would they not just do the minimal job to get that
Yeah.
done?
Well,
Yeah,
so the problem of there being vastly too many papers is one of
that's
the
also
ways
one.
science is in crisis, and that is driven by, again, institutions have a fair institutional process can't distinguish good papers from bad papers. It can just
Mm-hmm.
say, how many papers have you got? So
Mm-hmm.
everybody has to make as many papers as they can, and that has gotten to a point now where it's breaking down.
Maybe everyone can only make a certain number of papers per year, and then
Yeah. Well,
or
but
submit. Yeah.
that has been proposed, and it's
Uh-huh.
also been, I think, probably better proposal is that when the evaluation is done, you submit your 3 best papers,
Mm-hmm.
and you can publish as many papers as you like, but you're only going to get evaluated on the basis of 3. That seems like it has promise. I think some institutions have started doing that. I don't know if there's been follow-up, and if so, what the answer is.
I think this is a neat segue to one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about: a bridge to meta-rationality versus civilizational collapse, and just the broader arc of the narratives that you see as helpful for the 20th century and where we are now. So I was wondering if I could just paint 2 pictures, and then you can amend or add more detail.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for much of human history, at least when we look from a Western perspective, we were in what you would call the choiceless mode, where there wasn't a ton of questioning or deciding. There just kind of was an order that was taken as given. There's like a monarch, and no one would really question this great chain of being. But sometime in the Western scientific revolution, there were systems. Systems became like a focal point of culture at large, and we started to think more in systematic ways about physics and astronomy and how people are in the world. And then we started to expand from astronomy to math to engineering. This gave rise to a brief period where it seemed like things could be a system that's overall in coherence. And some of the pinnacle artifacts from that period are like Euclid's geometry and Newton's works. But what ends up happening is that in the early 20th century, we see things like non-Euclidean geometry. We see things like theories of the theory of relativity and these other impossibility theorems, which shatter the intellectual class's belief in the systems. And that shattering is intellectual shattering, but also cultural shattering. And the intellectual shattering leads to this period of disenchantment, and the cultural effect is seems to also manifest in the form of the countercultures. I guess this is the I'm blending a little bit the 2 narratives. One is the systematic narrative, and then the other is this slightly more cultural narrative. Things have kind of shattered, and we're in this post-systematic stage. And there still are narratives, but now there's not really the faith in a single larger narrative, right? And to go to the cultural story, the choiceless mode, which is also happens at the same time as the pre-systematic mode. At some point, maybe it was World War II, maybe it was the loss of faith in systems generally, but something happened that caused a wave of countercultures. And then the countercultures, they were somewhat united and almost seemed to like believe in one kind of thing to be counter against. But that then fragmented into subcultures like grunge and Nirvana and whatnot. And the subcultures then even fragmented to smaller parts, which you call the atomized mode. And now you still have things like subcultures, but there is even less of a sense of coherence among them. Would you amend or add to what I proposed there?
That's pretty much the story that I tell. It's not in any way original to me. That's fairly mainstream cultural history.
Would you put the narratives as this whole creation and collapse of systems as coinciding and intertwined with the counterculture subculture atomization narrative?
Mhm.
Or are there two places that each of those has come from?
I mean, the way in which the story that I told in How Meaning Fell Apart is, I assert that the foundational crisis in mathematics and physics was a major influence on culture and society starting to disintegrate. I don't know how true that is. That isn't, again, that's not original to me as an idea. Uh, I don't think it's particularly opposed by anybody, but it's not exactly mainstream. And it's, it's a quantitative claim. Did Gödel's proof actually lead to the hippie counterculture? I kind of claim that it did. And that sounds kind of far-fetched. I think it's probably right that there had been this very solid sense that the educated elite had, that everything was well-founded, and to some degree it was founded on Christianity, which disintegrated, but for the secular parts of the elite, everything was understood as being founded on scientific certainty. And then we don't have scientific certainty anymore. We don't even have mathematical certainty. So I think even for people my age, I just barely caught the end of modernity. So I kind of was educated in that worldview, but it was already disintegrating. I was in high school 74 to 78, and that is where postmodernity was starting to really bite. So I think for anybody younger than me, it is actually extremely difficult to imagine how important this sense of, okay, everything is under control because it is founded on scientific certainty, and we can trace everything back to that, and we have the right form of government because of scientific certainty, and our economy works the way it does because of scientific certainty. Just everything, the details of the culture, we can just sort of be confident and relaxed in a way that nobody can be relaxed now, because there's no ground anywhere. Everything since the 1970s has been constantly falling away, and there wasn't that sense of everything falling away. So I do think that connection is important.
Mm-hmm.
There was a very similar crisis, which is interesting, after heliocentrism was established. Again, it's impossible to imagine this, but geocentrism was just the foundation of everything. The whole world was based on geocentrism, and that just gave you a sense that you've got solid ground under you, which is, you know, that's the ground. And then suddenly you find out that the ground is spinning through space and there's nothing holding it up. It's just out there. And it was just a huge crisis. And the Aristotelian worldview, which was entwined with the Christian worldview, disintegrates if you don't have geocentrism. And there was this kind of nihilistic crisis of confidence, which, interestingly, the Newtonian worldview, which replaced that, again seemed to provide a solid ground. We have certainty about physics again, and everything actually makes sense. We're certain of it. And then that fell apart in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm. This this feels kind of akin to just paradigm changes generally.
Mhm.
Maybe do you think that what Thomas Kuhn talks about is just like a smaller scale version of this?
Well, these were his two main examples. His best book actually is called The Copernican Revolution. It's better than The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Nobody's read it. It's really excellent. It's kind of less deep, but it's just a beautiful story.
Mm.
But he talks about that in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions as well, and then relativity and quantum destroying the Newtonian worldview, which is the Enlightenment worldview. The Enlightenment was basically saying, hey, let's, we now actually know one thing. We know physics, so let's make everything work like Newton. That's the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And then Newton is false. Okay,
Yeah.
the whole Enlightenment project collapses.
Some other stories that I've been interested in are the technological critic account. What I understand Heidegger to be saying about technology and people like Herbert Marcuse, they say that one account of why we're so stuck is that there's a sense in which the technologies that we have created have domesticated us and like confused our sense making. And so James C. Scott has this pretty interesting claim about wheat and cereal crops domesticating humans. Things make a lot of sense if you actually think of giving them some type of agency. And so when we create more information technology, when we create more manufacturing, engineering technologies, there's a way in which they become autonomous and then they shape us.
Mm-hmm.
And so things like phones and computers, part of the fracture in meaning is that we're becoming captured by the logic of our own technology.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent do you think do you feel convinced by that narrative, and how might you place it in the ones that you've described?
Interesting. In general, I'm enthusiastic about technology. Yeah, I mean, we're both graduates of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for which I have a great deal of affection. And, I worked in the software industry for decades in various ways. The thesis that technologies become autonomous and control us to some extent, and there are some bad consequences of that. I think that's quite right. In my recent AI book, I talked about the fact that we're all, in a sense, cyborgs. We're partly artificial intelligence, partly because, a lot of my mind is Twitter. That's kind of how I think is Twitter, and it's
Mm-hmm.
where I live. And Twitter is backed by AI. It's, what it shows you and doesn't show you is decisions being made by AI programs running on a cloud server somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I rely on it, but it is also shaping what I think and how I think and who I am.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm a cyborg, and part of me is on the cloud. And, obviously that has some serious drawbacks and dangers.
One thing that's occurring to me is that maybe in making us cyborgs, there is like a bimodal thing happening where there's a bunch of cyborgs that are very confused because they don't see their appendages, and it's like their eyes, they think that their eyes are here, but their eyes are actually from their phones and their technologies. So they bumble around in the world and they end up being pretty ineffective for their own goals. But then there's another class of cyborgs that are actually able to see with these appendages and able to grasp like much larger agency and capability. So that makes me have a lot of sympathy or a lot of feeling for the fellow confused cyborgs, but also awe at the cyborgs that are able to seize the increased power.
Yeah, that seems right. And I think that it's not actually two groups. There's a spectrum
Yeah.
there, and also different people use information technology in quite different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And, most of us use it in many different ways as individuals, but my style of using social media is very different than I think most people's. Well, Heidegger's point is that technology inherently separates us from meaning. And I think there's something right in there. I mean, there's aspects of meaning that have to be embodied, and that, trees have to be healthy, you have to be made partly out of trees, and the tendency of technology is to cut you off from being partly trees because that kind of gets replaced with being partly a server farm.
He talks about everything turning into standing reserve,
Yeah.
and technology is leading us more and more into the instrumentalizing view as opposed to the attunement view or the poetic.
There was a sense coming from Heidegger in part that the crisis of nihilism was a crisis of not enough meaning. And I think that's somewhat off. Social media is constantly feeding you enormous quantities of meaning, way more meaning than you can deal with. It's overwhelming. There's this tsunami of meaning crashing over you. But there's some sense of it being the wrong kind of meaning, not sufficiently coherent.
There's something interesting about the metaphor you're using for meaning here, because it almost seems like the texts or the tweets are the meaning. But my sense of it is that, like, the meaning is the interaction of you and the embedded, like, knowledge of the texts. And yeah, maybe they're all of these things are potential pointers or handles that have their own very, very complex worldviews. But it seems like there is a way in which, like, you can't make meaning when there's all of these pointers that are incoherent too.
Yeah, I think it's enormously more difficult to assemble large-scale coherent meanings. Religion is an obvious example where that, I think, has been hugely damaged by electronic media now. I think it's very difficult to be a genuine Christian now in a way that it wasn't 50 years ago. You could be a genuine Christian then. And it's not that we no longer believe in God or something. It's that we can't hold together a coherent worldview in the way that's necessary for being a real Christian. Yeah.
The one thing that I guess there's still the Heidegger thread. The thing that I'm uncertain about is, it seems like there are some technologies that clearly do afford new types of meaning. I mean, we're talking here via, video conference, and we're having a conversation that feels to me that there's new forms of meaning being made. That's one example. But also, I wonder about the psychotechnologies, what I was referring to as before. When you do things like meditate, and whether it's alone or with a partner, it really does feel like there's a type of attunement that's possible, and that yet these are also kind of techniques or technologies. So for me, that feels like the most doubtful about this claim that technologies inherently have to turn things into instrumentalizing.
Yeah. No, I think Heidegger had a point, but was wrong about it being absolute. It's been a long time since I've read that, so I don't know how absolute he made the claim. I'm not on board with technology strips everything of meaning. Even an individual tweet has meaning for me, but there's much more in terms of Twitter community, that there's people who I interact with on Twitter whose names I don't know. I know their Twitter handle and I've no idea what their real name is, and that's fine. I feel like these are people I'm close to.